Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most wild contradictions in modern history. If you want to understand how authoritarian superpowers are so often born out of promises of absolute freedom, well, there's arguably no better case study than Vladimir Lenin. We're going to look closely at the massive gap between his revolutionary utopian ideals on paper and the actual heavy state apparatus that he helped create after 1917.
So here's the big question we need to unpack. How exactly does a guy whose core political philosophy revolves around completely and utterly dismantling the state end up laying the groundwork for one of the most centralized, formidable superpowers the world has ever seen? It's a fascinating historical paradox, and we're going to see exactly what happens when utopian theory meets the brutal, unforgiving pressures of survival.
To get to the bottom of this, we'll hit 6 key areas: the man and the myth, his critique of the state, smashing the bourgeois state, the socialist transition, the communist ideal, and finally, theory versus reality. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The Man and the Myth. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov.
Think about this timeline for a second. Born into a wealthy family in 1870, right? By 1917, he's leading the October Revolution. By 1922, he's founding the USSR, and then he passes away just a couple years later at age 54. The sheer whiplash here is astonishing. This is a man who was living in quiet, obscure exile in Switzerland in early 1917, and just a few short years later, he was running a massive nation.
And there's this massive gap between the actual guy and the myth that came later. In reality, Lenin was this small, wiry, super contradictory figure who absolutely hated personality cults. He got radicalized early on after his older brother was executed for plotting against the Tsar, which obviously added this immense personal fuel to his fire. But the historical irony? Today he's literally embalmed in a Moscow mausoleum. The man who would have hated being a broad-shouldered godlike statue is now a permanent physical icon requiring regular chemical baths to preserve his body.
Moving right along to Section 2, Critique of the State, the Bourgeois Machine.
Before we look at what he did, we have to understand his theoretical baseline. In his writing, especially The State and Revolution, Lenin makes it crystal clear. The state is not some neutral referee just trying to keep the peace between opposing sides. Not at all. He saw it as a weapon, a tool wielded by the winning class to systematically hold down the losers. So, in his mind, you can't just gently vote your way into reforming a capitalist parliament. The system itself exists purely to exploit.
Which brings us to Section 3, Smashing the Bourgeois State, the Violent Break.
Because the state is inherently oppressive, Lenin argued you literally had to completely and violently destroy it. Just look at the contrast in his theory. The bourgeois state relies on a specialized standing army and police to control the masses. But his vision for a proletarian state, no specialized police, just the armed people themselves, and instead of career politicians in a talking shop parliament, you'd have active working bodies, regular workers, getting paid average wages whose power could be revoked by the public at any second if they didn't deliver.
So here is the actual master plan, straight from his theory. Step 1, violently smash the bourgeois state. Step 2, enter a transitional socialist phase. Step 3, the state gradually withers away. And Step 4, full stateless communism. Honestly, it's wild to think he was mapping out this incredibly radical roadmap while literally hiding from authorities in a hay hut in Finland during the chaotic summer of 1917.
Let's zoom in on that second step. Section 4, the socialist transition, the dictatorship of the proletariat. Now, dictatorship of the proletariat, that term sounds intensely authoritarian to us today, right? But Lenin actually saw it as this massive expansion of democracy for the poor majority. The catch, though, is he firmly believed the old elites wouldn't just hand over their wealth and power peacefully. So this transitional state was explicitly designed to use targeted violence to crush the resistance of those former oppressors. It openly acknowledged it was an instrument of class struggle. It was just aiming the weapon in the opposite direction.
He famously wrote, "Every cook must govern the state." It's a brilliant quote. He wanted to completely dismantle the elite bureaucracy by making literally every single citizen take turns running the administration. Think about how much people complain about out-of-touch, deep state bureaucracies today. Lenin was tapping into that exact same sentiment over a century ago. If everyone takes a turn, no separate elevated bureaucratic class can ever take root.
The whole setup for this phase is pretty fascinating. Society basically becomes one giant, equally paid office. Everyone does the accounting. Everyone gets an average worker's wage. By doing this, Lenin believed the state would slowly begin to wither away. It's a clever bit of logic. If absolutely everyone is a temporary bureaucrat, then effectively, no one is a permanent bureaucrat. You destroy the state by making everyone an active part of it.
But, and this is crucial, Lenin totally recognized this phase wasn't perfect. It was still technically unjust. Why? Because simply paying everyone equally for equal work ignores reality. If a single person and a father of 5 both get exactly 1 loaf of bread for a day's work, well, that's equal on paper, but it's wildly unequal in reality because their needs are entirely different. This is a necessary but temporary phase of what he called equal inequality.
Which leads us to the ultimate goal, Section 5, the communist ideal, the withering away.
From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. You've probably heard this famous maxim. This is it, complete communism. This is the utopian finish line, where the state becomes absolutely unnecessary and just vanishes into thin air. Once society hits real equality, where every individual's unique needs are actually met without question, you simply don't need a state to enforce rules anymore.
But to actually pull this off, the preconditions are staggering. The divide between physical and intellectual labor has to end. Work has to transform from something you do just to survive into a primary human need. And maybe the biggest hurdle, it requires this massive, profound anthropological shift. People would have to just naturally follow social rules out of habit without police or armies forcing them to. It's an absolutely massive leap of faith regarding human nature.
So how did all that actually pan out? Section 6, Theory versus Reality, the Historical Paradox.
This is where utopian theory violently collides with the chaotic world of 1917 Russia. The man who theorized the complete destruction of the state ended up constructing one of the most formidable state machines in human history. Instead of armed workers replacing the army, they built a massive, highly structured standing army. Instead of dissolving the bureaucracy so every cook could govern, an immense, permanent bureaucratic apparatus entrenched itself at every single level of society.
Historical sources neutrally note that extreme material conditions forced the revolution into desperate survival mode. Almost immediately, they faced a devastating civil war, famine, and invasions by 14 different foreign armies. The actual working class, the people meant to be governing, were fleeing the starving cities just to stay alive. So, to keep the crumbling country running, Lenin actually had to employ the old czarist bureaucrats, and by 1921, facing internal collapse, he banned party factions entirely, which effectively snuffed out any remaining internal democracy.
Which means Lenin leaves behind an immensely polarizing dual legacy. On one hand, his philosophy provided a global framework for anti-colonial movements, inspiring marginalized rebels all over the world to fight for liberation. But on the exact same hand, historical records clearly show he was personally responsible for the deaths of thousands of political opponents and meticulously built the autocratic machine that paved the way for Joseph Stalin's brutal totalitarian regime.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a thought. If a movement seizes state power with the absolute intention of destroying the state, do they inevitably just become the very thing they set out to smash? It's a heavy question about the nature of power, and one that history is definitely still asking us today.